So, Catherine sat in front of a camera last week and did the one thing the palace almost never permits. She had been given a script. The communications team had written it, the way they write everything, and by the time enough advisors had passed it around, every sentence had been worn smooth. She looked at it, she read it through, then she flipped it face down on the table beside her and spoke about her youngest son in her own voice. Without notes, without clearance, and without warning anyone she intended to. And she cried while she did it, not at the beginning, roughly 2/3 of the way through, on a sentence about Louis, and she kept talking rather than stopping, which is somehow harder to watch than if she had fallen apart completely. Now the palace has a record here. Kensington does not do tears. Everything that reaches you about those 3 children has been planned, cleared, and timed. And that is not cynicism. That is the actual deliberate policy for more than a decade. And the question that matters is not what Catherine said. The question is, what drove a woman that disciplined to say it at all? Because something had been unfolding in that family for months, and the country had sensed the outline of it without being able to name it. Appearances rearranged with nothing said. Schedules moved at short notice. A boy who simply stopped turning up anywhere. No explanation offered. No explanation coming. And a press office that answered every question about the youngest, Wales child with the same 4 polite words about family privacy. That silence was not an accident. William built it. He argued for it from the very beginning and defended it for years, against people inside his own household who kept warning him it was going to collapse, and then it collapsed. In the one way nobody in that building had anticipated. And I will get to exactly how, because it is not what you are expecting. If you are new here, subscribe before we go further because this story is still developing and there is more of it coming this month. Quick note before we continue. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. The filings, the official records, the stories that got buried before anyone finished asking questions. What you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together as I read them. Stay with me to the end because that last section is where this whole thing lands. And it lands on a conversation between a father and an 8-year-old boy on the floor of a garden room. Start with the policy because the policy is real and it is older than most people know. George was born in 2013. Within roughly a year of that, William and Catherine settled on an approach to their children that has not shifted since. And the Scottish Daily Express described it this month accurately as a decade-long plan to let those children live normal lives. That framing comes from actual reporting, not from me. 10 years of deliberate choices about where those children appear, how often, at what age, and in whose company. You have been watching the results of it your whole life without registering it. 3 children who appear perhaps a handful of times each year. Christmas at Sandringham, a balcony appearance, a carefully selected sporting event, photographs put out by their own mother rather than captured by anyone else, on her own camera, on her own schedule. Because a photograph you release is one nobody can sell. That is the system William constructed, and he built it for a reason that has nothing to do with modern communications, strategy, and everything to do with it. Saturday in September 1997, he was 15. He walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the entire world watched, and every private thing Diana had ever possessed became public property within her letters, her handwriting, her clothing sold and put on display, her voice on recordings she never meant anyone to hear. William understood at 15 exactly what this country does with a royal life once it gets hold of the details. And he has spent nearly 30 years since making sure it never gets hold of his children. Every closed door in this story starts there. Hold on to that because by the end of this video, it turns completely back on him. Now, the past several months are where the policy stopped working, and the timeline is worth setting out properly. Louis is 8. He is the youngest of the 3, which in that family means he carries the least defined role and the most protection. Both of those things have been true his entire life. George is 13 and has a future everyone can describe. Charlotte is 11 and has been building a public presence since she could walk. Louis has been the one held back. For a considerable stretch this year, he was held back entirely. Appearances that had been penciled in dropped off the schedule. 2 family events he had attended in previous years went ahead without him. The pattern was consistent enough that people who follow this family closely started counting the months, and the counting produced precisely the kind of speculation the policy was designed to prevent, which is the first irony in a story that turns out to be full of them. And I want to give the policy fair credit before we watch it unravel, because it held for a decade and almost nobody acknowledges that. Those 3 children have grown up with something no royal child before them had. George got to be 9 years old and appeared in public about 4 times. Charlotte has never had a school photograph sold to a newspaper. Nobody has a long lens photograph of any of them crying or falling over or having the sort of afternoon every child has and no child should see printed. Compare that to what William and Harry were by the age of 8, which was a running feature in the national press with photographers posted outside the school gates. William built that deliberately against significant pressure. and it is probably the single most effective thing he has done as a public figure. Hold that in your head, because the reason this story is painful is that the thing that failed was not a mistake. It was his finest work. The turning point came at Windsor during a private rehearsal, and it is the moment Catherine later described as the point where she could no longer hold the line. The rehearsal was meant to be gentle, a practice run before a formal appearance, in a room with no crowds, no cameras, no one outside the household present, so the boy could work out how to stand and where to walk without any audience observing how it went. Halfway through the morning, Louis stopped and reached for his mother's hand, and he asked her whether he was allowed to be seen. Not whether he wanted to go, whether he was allowed it. Catherine knelt beside him and took both his hands, and she has since told at least 2 people that she could not produce a single sentence in reply that was both truthful and reassuring at the same time. William cleared the room of everyone except the staff who had to remain, and he had George and Charlotte taken to another part of the house, because he did not want either of them watching their brother ask that question. That morning changed the atmosphere inside that household completely, and everything that followed was people responding to it. William's reaction was to close everything down. He suspended every engagement involving Louis with immediate effect and made clear he had no interest in discussing it. One missed ceremony, he said, meant nothing beside a child who had started to believe there was a reason he was being kept away. Honestly, it is hard to argue with the instinct. It is also the moment everything began to unravel, and the people who tried to say so were the ones no one in that family ever listens to. Senior advisors warned him that repeated absences would attract attention, and I should explain that word because it does real work in that building. An engagement in royal terms is an official duty or public appearance, carried out on behalf of the monarchy, and the entire visible life of that institution is constructed from them. They are booked months ahead. They are logged. They are published, and when a member of the family stops appearing at them, the absence is a matter of record rather than rumor. You do not need a contact inside the palace to spot it. You need a diary. The advisors wanted a brief, controlled explanation released before speculation filled the vacuum. Something short, something vague, something that would let the press office field questions with a document rather than a shrug. And the advisors were not being cynical, which is the part people consistently misread about that profession. Their entire purpose is to look 18 months ahead and identify which silence is about to become a problem. They had watched this exact shape before, with Catherine herself in 2024, when a gap in the public schedule and an unwillingness to explain it produced months of speculation that went to places no one had foreseen and caused real harm to a real person. Before the palace finally said what was happening, they were not asking William to expose his son. They were telling him that an unexplained absence does not remain empty, and that someone always fills it, and that he would not get to choose who. William refused, flatly, repeatedly, for months. He would not allow his son's situation to become a public story while the child was still frightened and uncertain, and he had 30 years of personal evidence for why that mattered. He was right about the danger and wrong about the solution, and the gap between those two things is the whole of this story. Because the silence did not stay contained around Louis, it spread through the house, and it got into the other 2 children, and neither parent noticed until it was firmly established. George is 13, which is old enough to understand that something is wrong and young enough to believe it is his responsibility to absorb it. He decided that calm was expected of him. He got quieter, more careful, more useful around the house. And both parents read that as him coping well, because that is what it looks like from the outside. Then one evening, he asked his father whether a younger brother could be kept out of everything without anyone outside the family knowing. Sit with that question for a moment, because it is not a question about procedure. He was asking whether the silence meant something was seriously wrong. He was 13 years old, working out on his own that his family had stopped explaining things and trying to establish whether the not explaining was the ordinary kind or the frightening kind. Charlotte is 11, and she went the opposite direction entirely. She registered every closed door. She noticed every conversation that shifted when she came into a room, every lowered voice, every adult who suddenly found somewhere else to be. Nobody sat her down and told her anything, and she assembled a reasonably accurate picture anyway, because 11-year-olds always do, and adults never accept it. And she did something with it that I keep returning to. She started leaving handwritten jokes beside her brother's bed, not once, regularly, as a deliberate practice. She had figured out on her own that when Louis laughed, he came back for a little while, and she set about producing that deliberately in pencil without mentioning it to anyone. And later, when she overheard staff discussing the attention the family was beginning to attract, she found her mother and asked whether strangers were worried about her brother. Then she asked whether Louis was going to have to answer them all. An 11-year-old should not be running that calculation. She ran it anyway because no one had given her anything else to go on. And I am going to hold the most important scene in this entire story back for a while because it happens between William and his son, and it happens on a floor. And if I give it to you now, it is just a man and a boy sitting down, and you will not understand why it turned a future king inside out. It is coming. Everything between here and there is the reason it lands. Catherine was carrying something different from either of them, and she was carrying it on her own. She was sitting with Charlotte, explaining that these things sometimes move slowly while getting almost no sleep herself. She was keeping her worst fears from William to protect him. He was doing exactly the same thing back at her for exactly the same reason, and neither of them had noticed they had both stopped saying anything real to one another. That is what prolonged strain does to two people who love each other and are both trying to be the steady one. Nothing breaks. There is no argument, no coldness, nothing you could put your finger on. The warmth just goes quiet and stays quiet. And after a few months, you are two people running parallel operations in the same house. And Louis was in the middle of it, 8 years old, too young to understand anything about how that institution works, and old enough to read a room full of adults perfectly. He has always been the one who fills a quiet room. Anyone who has watched this family in public over the past 6 years knows exactly who he is, because he is the one who cannot sit still through a ceremony, and the one whose face ends up on front pages doing something his grandmother would have raised an eyebrow at. Questions, noise, sudden energy, an ongoing negotiation with his mother about whether he has to stand up now. Being the youngest of 3 in that household means fewer expectations placed on you. It also means you are the least explained person in the building. George's future gets discussed. Charlotte's role gets discussed. Louis had been allowed to simply be a child, which is the kindest thing they could have done for him, and which left him with no framework at all for understanding why he had suddenly stopped going anywhere. The house got quieter around him. That is the part he actually noticed. Not a decision, not a conversation, just adults adjusting their volume. All of that leads to the night this whole thing broke open. And it broke open between the two of them after the children had gone to bed. Catherine had written her own statement by hand on paper over several sittings, and she placed those pages in front of her husband and let him read them. The palace draft was sitting right beside them. And if the term is unfamiliar, a palace-approved statement is language that royal advisors have signed off on before public release, and its purpose is to say something without creating anything new for anyone to ask about. It is genuinely skilled work. Every clause has been checked against what it might mean 6 months later. To Catherine, those sentences were hollow. They described a situation without acknowledging that any fear had been part of it. They noted things were improving without saying a word about what the family had actually been living through. They were, in the precise sense, unfalsifiable, and that is what she could not stand about them. William read the opening line of her version and was shaking his head before he reached the second. He told her that one public statement can be replayed, analyzed, and quoted back at that boy for the rest of his life. He asked whether she was prepared to watch their son discussed by people who have never met him and never will, and his voice rose and then stopped mid-sentence because both of them understood at the same moment that the anger was fear wearing a different coat. Catherine did not retreat, and what she said next is the thing this entire video exists to tell you. She told him that Louis had begun to believe he was being kept from sight because the family was ashamed of him. Read that again. Not because he was unwell, not because anything was the matter with him, because he had worked out at 8 years old that he was the one who did not get to go, that nobody would tell him why, and that when he walked into a room, the conversation changed. A child given no explanation will construct one, and the one he constructed was that he was the problem. That is what a decade of careful protection had produced inside the head of the person it was designed to protect. She pushed the official draft away across the table and told William there was nothing in it that resembled the boy they had nearly watched stop believing in himself. She pointed out that George and Charlotte had both learned to lower their voices whenever their brother was mentioned, that their eldest was watching every closed door in the building, that their daughter was leaving jokes on a bed because she had worked out on her own, that laughter brought her brother back. The silence had stopped protecting one child. It was shaping all 3, and then she told him the thing that settled the argument because it had not come from her at all. Louis had made a request on his own, unprompted, and he had thought about it beforehand. He wanted to thank the people who had made him feel safe. He wanted George and Charlotte to know that what they had done had mattered. And more than either of those, he did not want people thinking he had vanished because he was not brave enough. William sat down. He put his hands over his face for a moment and then said something I still think is remarkable from a man raised from birth to maintain his composure in public. He admitted that his choices had not only been about privacy, they had been about his own fear of losing control of what happens to the people he loves. That is the most honest sentence anyone in that family has produced in years. And it explains everything he has done since 1997, in a single line. They reached an understanding together that night. Catherine could speak. She would keep the private details private, and she would stop pretending the past several months had been manageable. One figure still had authority to stop it entirely, and he is the one person in that family who has lived through exactly this himself. Charles received the draft after an evening briefing. The first thing he did was clear the room. He read the pages twice, and when he reached the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, he took his glasses off and set them on the desk and did not pick them up again for some time. Understand why that line landed on that particular man. Charles has spent his entire life inside an institution that teaches restraint before anyone is old enough to grasp what restraint costs. He was taught it. He passed it to his sons, and one of them has spent 20 years telling anyone who will listen how much damage it caused. And in February of 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that Charles had been diagnosed with cancer, and he has spent the 2.5 years since working out in public exactly how much of his own situation the country is entitled to know. He is not reading that sentence as a grandfather. He is reading it as someone who has been the subject of the same argument. William arrived shortly afterwards, and Charles asked him one question. He asked whether the statement actually served Louis or whether it just made the adults around him feel more comfortable. That is a brutal question, and it is the right one. Every family in this position tells itself it is protecting the child. A fair portion of the time it is protecting itself from having to say difficult things aloud, and the child absorbs the difference immediately. William defended his wife's judgment. He also admitted the thing he had been sitting with since the beginning of it, which is that the moment a recording exists, the family loses control of the story. Journalists would go back through the absences. They would question the decisions. They would go searching for everything the family had deliberately left out, and they would find some of it. He was right about that too. As it happened, all of it came to pass. The communications team had prepared a safer version by then, and this is the detail that decided everything. Their version was shorter, calmer, and it had removed the section where Louis thanks the people who helped him. They had taken out the only line in the entire document that belonged to the child. Charles rejected it. His reasoning, according to someone present for the exchange, was that a statement stripped of the boy's own meaning would protect the institution while failing the person standing in the center of it, and that this was the precise trade the monarchy had spent a century making badly. He approved Catherine's version on one condition, and the condition is the thing I would put on the front of a newspaper if I ran one. Louis had to hear every word before it went out. Not a summary, not the gist, the whole thing read to him so that he understood precisely what the country was about to be told about him and had the chance to say no. Consider how unusual that is. An 8-year-old given an actual veto over a royal statement about his own life by the king. In writing, Catherine read him the final version in private. He listened to the whole thing with a gravity she had not seen from him before, and when she finished, he corrected exactly one phrase. She had written that he was doing better. He did not want that. He told her he wanted people to know he was getting strong again. She changed the sentence immediately. Sit with the difference between those two things, because an 8-year-old found it and a room of professional communicators had not. Doing better is something that happens to you. Getting strong again is something you are doing. One describes a patient. The other describes a person with something to accomplish and every intention of finishing it. He heard the passive voice and he rejected it. And he did it without any of the vocabulary anyone would use to explain why. Charles approved the revised wording with a note in his own handwriting. It said that truth delivered with restraint could protect the crown more honestly than silence. And that note is the closest thing this story has to a pivot because it overturns something that institution has operated on since before any of these people were born. The default has always been that saying nothing is the safe position. Charles put it down in writing, in his own hand, that in this case, the safe position was the dangerous one. The recording went out. Catherine spoke steadily, thanked the people who had looked after her son, and said his strength was returning. 2/3 of the way through, she cried and carried on, and the palace did not edit it out. The response was immediate and considerably larger than anyone had anticipated. Phones lit up, headlines within the hour, messages arriving at the palace faster than anyone could process them. And then the coverage turned, and it turned in exactly the direction William had spent months warning everyone it would. Broadcasters began building time. Someone in a graphics department pulled every appearance Louis had made in the previous 18 months and set them against the dates of the ones he had missed. And by the second evening, that chart was running on 3 channels. Old family footage appeared alongside the new statement. Presenters began using the phrase "in recent months" in the tone that means we are about to speculate. Then one commentator did the thing that ended it for William. He was reviewing footage from well before any of this had started. Ordinary footage. A family walking somewhere, and he paused on the boy's face, and he began going through the child's expression on air, frame by frame, telling an audience what a 7-year-old had or had not been feeling on an afternoon 2 summers ago. William was watching. He got up out of his chair, put his hand toward the screen as though he could physically stop the man, and then found the remote and switched the television off in the middle of the sentence. And he said one thing to the 2 or 3 people in that room, and everyone who was there has repeated it since. My son is not entertainment. 5 words from a man who had spent his entire adult life saying nothing at all about his children. Not a statement, not a line approved by anyone. No press office anywhere near it. A father standing in his own sitting room with his hand still half raised toward the screen, telling a room full of staff exactly what he thought of what he had just watched. I want you to hold that image because it is the whole argument in one shot. A man who spent 30 years building a barrier around his children, sitting in his own home, watching a stranger freeze-frame his 8-year-old's face and narrate it to the country. Everything he had feared happening on his own screen. For days after he agreed to let his wife speak, he had been right. That is the uncomfortable part of this story that most of the coverage moved straight past. William was right about what would happen. He was simply wrong about what the alternative was costing. But something else was happening outside the gates that week, and it is the reason this ended up meaning something to people with no particular connection to this family at all. People began leaving handwritten blue stars outside Windsor Castle. Paper, cardboard, whatever was to hand. Blue, because that was the color that had circulated, and each one carrying the same 3 words the boy had chosen for himself. Getting strong again. They accumulated along the public barriers over about 4 days, and most of them were not addressed to Louis. Most of them were addressed to someone else. A child in a hospital in Leeds, a grandson recovering, a daughter who had been having a hard year, all written by people who had come to Windsor to leave a message for a prince and ended up leaving one for someone of their own. That castle has seen a great deal of this. Celebration, mourning, national uncertainty, the whole range. And this country has a specific and complicated history with leaving things at royal gates, because the last time it happened on that scale was 1997, when the flowers piled 10 feet deep outside Kensington, and the message beneath them was an accusation. The nation stood at those gates and told that family it had mishandled a child's grief. 29 years later, the same country stood at a different gate and left paper stars for a boy it was worried about. Nobody planned that parallel. William of all people would have noticed it. A newspaper ran Catherine's face across the front page beneath 3 words. A mother's voice. Underneath, in smaller type, they repeated the phrase Louis had insisted on. That front page did something the palace could not have engineered. It did not present the boy as fragile or diminished. It presented what he was doing as courage, and it placed a mother's honesty above the institution's polish. And it did it on the day when several other outlets were running the frame-by-frame footage. Not everyone took that approach, and the pushback was real. Commentators wanted to know why the palace had stayed quiet for months. They wanted the earlier absences explained. Some made the argument, and it is not a foolish argument, that a family funded by the public cannot decide unilaterally which parts of its working life are private. Palace officials pushed back on that harder than they usually push back on anything. A child's situation, they said, is not public property. The family had said enough to acknowledge what had happened without surrendering every detail of it. And when one phrase from the recording began generating serious speculation, the phrase about the moment they had feared things were moving the wrong way, the advisors returned and recommended a second clarification. Get ahead of it. 3 more sentences and close the gap before it expands. Catherine refused. She said explaining every frightening detail would destroy the very privacy they had spent months guarding, and that she had not been through all of this in order to end up doing, at the end, what she had refused to do at the start. That is the moment she wins the argument she has been having with that building since the first draft arrived. She had proven she was willing to speak. Now she proved she was willing to stop. And those 2 things together are what made the whole thing hold. And look at what the episode cost, in plain terms, because the accounting is worth doing. The family surrendered something they had protected for more than a decade. That policy is now permanently altered, and everyone involved knows it. Once you have spoken about one of your children in your own voice, you have established that speaking is possible, and every future silence gets measured against the one time you did not stay silent. William has spent this year handing the press a precedent he spent a decade refusing to give them. Against that, they gained one thing. An 8-year-old stopped believing he was something to be ashamed of. I have thought about whether that exchange was worth it, and I have concluded, yes. And I want to say plainly that people I respect on this subject have concluded the opposite. The argument against is that the boy would have grown through it, that children misinterpret things constantly and recover, and that the family sacrificed a decade of hard-won protection to resolve a problem that time would have resolved anyway. It is not a foolish argument. It may even be correct. The argument for it is what happened in a garden room a few days later. And once you have heard that, the accounting stops looking balanced. The real hinge of this story never happened in front of a camera at all. It happened in a garden room on the floor, and nobody outside that house knew about it for weeks. A few days after the recording went out, William went looking for his son and found him sitting alone in the family's garden room. No doctors, no siblings, no staff, no protective adults arranging anything. A boy sitting quietly in an empty room. There was a chair right beside him. William ignored it and sat down on the floor so he was level with the child rather than above him. Then he asked one question. He asked Louis how he felt now that people knew. Louis took a while to answer. And what he said first was not about the statement or the public or any of the things his parents had spent months agonizing over. He said he had noticed that his father stopped talking about royal events whenever he came into the room. Follow what that means. Royal engagements used to sound exciting to him. He is 8, and the family business involves helicopters and crowds and his father doing important things in other cities, and he had grown up hearing about all of it. Then, over a period of months, all of that conversation evaporated the moment he walked in. William had done that deliberately. He had removed every mention of duty from the boy's hearing so that Louis would not feel pressure about when he might attend something again, and Louis had drawn the only conclusion available, which was that everyone had decided he was never going to be well enough to go back. That is what silence does. You cannot choose what it communicates. William took away the pressure, and the boy heard exclusion. And there was no version of that exchange the father could have managed because he never had it. Then Louis told him something William had not known, and it is the reason this video carries the title it carries. He said it the way children say the worst things, directly, with no preamble before it. I heard you crying. 4 words on a floor in a garden room. From an 8-year-old to the future King of England. During the worst week of everything, Louis had heard his father crying outside his bedroom door. He had been awake. He heard all of it, and he pretended to be asleep because at 8 years old, he could not work out what he was supposed to do with a crying father. And pretending seemed kinder than letting the man know he had been heard. Take a moment with that, because there are 2 separate things inside it, and both of them are devastating. The first is William, a man trained since childhood to hold himself together in front of the entire world. Standing in a corridor in his own home in the middle of the night, unable to do it any longer, believing he was alone. The second is the boy, 8 years old, lying in the dark, calculating whether letting his father know he had been overheard would make things better or worse for his father, and deciding it would make them worse. That is a form of care. He was protecting the adult. He had been doing it for months and had not said a word to anyone, and the only reason it ever emerged is that his father sat down on a floor and asked him a genuine question. That admission broke the composure the future king had been carrying throughout all of it. William drew his son close and held him and told him that courage has never meant the absence of fear. It means speaking when staying quiet would be easier. That is word for word the argument his wife had been putting to him for months, arriving from a completely different direction out of the mouth of the very person the whole argument had been about. Louis held on to him and then made a decision of his own. He wanted to return gradually. No grand event, nothing formal, nothing with a schedule and a route and a rehearsal. Something small where George and Charlotte could stay beside him. Catherine came in after it had all finished. She saw her husband's face, then looked at her son and understood immediately that something in that house had shifted for good. The 2 of them agreed on the spot. No statement, no arranged appearance, no pressure of any kind, until the boy said he was ready himself. He said so in the summer. On the 1st of August, 2026, William and Catherine took all 3 children to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. And that is not a dramatized moment. That happened, and most of you will have seen the photographs. They went as a family, rather than as a formal royal delegation. In Scotland, William and Catherine carry the titles Duke and Duchess of Rothesay, and none of the ceremony that usually attaches to that was in evidence. They watched the netball semi-final at the Hydro, England against Jamaica, and England lost. They went to the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome for the cycling. Louis wore a Welsh cycling bucket hat that was slightly too large and spent a considerable portion of the afternoon underneath it. At some point, he fist-bumped Finn, the game's mascot, which is a photograph that went around the world in roughly 2 hours. And nothing about that day was arranged, which is precisely the point of it. Nobody announced in advance that the children were coming. No statement was attached. No explanation. No reference to any of the previous months from anyone in that family or that press office. They simply turned up at a sporting event with 3 children and sat in the stands alongside several thousand other people in the building. And the country worked out what it was looking at on its own. George is 13 now. Charlotte is 11. Louis is 8. Before they went in, Louis stopped. Charlotte took one of his hands. George took the other. Neither parent said anything, and Catherine in particular did not urge him forward and did not try to conceal the fact that he had paused. She waited until he chose the moment himself. Then all 3 of them went in together. William watched that and understood something that had taken him the better part of a year to reach. Getting back to normal was never going to mean reconstructing the arrangement that had existed before. It meant building a different one. He had spent his whole adult life measuring protection by how much the family withheld, because that is the lesson he took from 1997. And it is not a wrong lesson. He came to accept eventually that silence can keep a child physically safe and leave him entirely alone inside it at the same time. Both of those things can be true, and for a time, both of them were. Catherine had learned the reverse. Honesty could bring her son out from under the belief that he was something to be ashamed of, and it could not become permission to hand over every private detail of his life. She used a personal recorded statement rather than a press release, specifically because that format allowed her to tell the truth and then stop, and the stopping mattered as much as the telling. Charles said something privately later that I believe will end up being the most quoted thing to emerge from all of this if it is ever confirmed properly. He said the monarchy had not been weakened by any of it. He believed it had emerged stronger for having been through something difficult without turning the difficulty into a production. Coming from him, that is a significant sentence. That institution has run on restraint for a very long time, and restraint has cost people. This year suggested that dignity and emotional honesty are not in opposition, and the House of Windsor has spent a century proceeding as though they were. Louis came back from the velodrome and found his parents, and he did not ask whether he would be permitted to attend another one. He asked when he could return. That question is the whole ending, not the statement, not the front page, not the stars. A boy, assuming without checking that there would be a next time, Catherine was sent a photograph of the display outside Windsor, and she looked through it and rested her fingers on one message written by another child. She asked quietly that the whole thing be kept for Louis rather than cleared away. William read a letter from a father who had been through his own version of this, trying to explain something difficult to children who were too young for the full answer and too old to be fobbed off. And it landed on him that what his family had done had reached far beyond Windsor. Louis kept 1 star. It sits beside his bed. The message on it says that he was brave even when he was resting. The palace responded to all of it with restraint, which was correct. No campaign, no commemorative photographs, no hurried return, no interviews, no follow-up statement, because none of what Catherine did was defiance, and none of it was performance. Whatever the people who wanted a second clarification believed, she corrected a story that fear had written, and she gave her son permission to think of himself as someone recovering rather than someone broken. That family spent the better part of a year believing that love meant building the walls high enough. They came out of it understanding that protection also means listening and admitting when you are frightened, and occasionally letting an 8-year-old tell you that you have got it wrong. The silence did its job for as long as it had a job to do. Then, it needed to end, and only one person in that building was prepared to say so. And the people who resisted her deserve the final word here, because they have not had to account for any of it. The advisors who wrote the clean draft, the ones who removed Louis's own thanks from the statement because it complicated the messaging, the ones who came back afterwards asking for a second clarification to close a gap that was never theirs to close. Every one of them was doing their job properly, and every one of them would have given that boy a document about his own life, with his own words removed from it, and gone home satisfied. They protect the institution. Someone in that building has to protect the 8-year-old, and for months, the only person doing it was a mother with a pen and a piece of paper. She was not authorized to write. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe, because there is more coming on this family before the month is out, and I will bring it to you.